Are you afraid to try intuitive eating because you might binge? You're probably thinking, I could never be an intuitive eater because there's literally foods in the house that I cannot coexist with. You feel like if you eat your fear foods, these foods that you feel out of control with, or like you're never satiated with, you just never stop eating them. By the way, if you want to learn more about fear foods, definitely check out my video on fear foods in the link above. But if you have fear foods, so these are foods that cause you guilt, anxiety, shame, or any other plethora of negative emotions when you think about having the food, you eat the food, or after the food. These are the foods that might make you fearful of going on this intuitive eating journey. So, how do you eat intuitively without binging? This is kind of a complicated answer because you actually might have to binge to intuitively eat. I know we want the secret sauce to just being able to stop when we're full and start eating when we get those hunger cues. Here's the problem with that. This quickly becomes the Hunger-Fullness diet, which is just another bullshit scheme of diet culture to keep you confined to food rules. So we don't have to always stop eating when we're full, when we intuitively eat. That's actually part of learning to be an intuitive eater is learning that there is different types of fullness, there's different levels of fullness, and that all of these things are okay reasons to eat. So now you're thinking, okay, I don't even have to stop when I'm full as I'm intuitively eating. What is the catch, Sheena? I am never going to stop eating if I go on this intuitive eating journey. Here's the thing. All binge eating comes from food restriction. So if you're feeling out of control with a food, it's because you've set limits around that food. So, the unfortunate reality when it comes to intuitively eating and learning to expose yourselves to those foods that you don't feel comfortable being in the room with is that you might have to binge at first. So, first, I want to stop and really clarify the difference between binge eating, emotional eating, and overeating. These are actually all different things. And if you are wanting to learn to be an intuitive eater, we are actually going to need to know what is happening in the body so we're able to respond appropriately and determine whether or not we want to continue having that food choice or whether we want to make a different decision. So, first, I want to say is that all of these things, binge eating, emotional eating, and overeating, are okay. And that's part of learning to be an intuitive eater is really accepting that at some points in our lives, we might do one or more or all of these things. But we want to know what's happening in our emotional state as well as within our body so we're able to handle those things appropriately. So, first, let's talk about overeating. So, overeating is when we simply maybe enjoy a food a lot or the food's not available a lot. So, it's an opportunity. And this often happens as we start an intuitive eating journey. In fact, overeating happens far more frequently than emotional eating or binge eating as we start an intuitive eating journey. And that's because we just haven't had a lot of practice navigating our body where our hunger starts and where our fullness ends, and all of those variations in between of different levels of hunger and different levels of fullness. So we need to practice a little bit as to when we are actually full and when that feels good in our body and if we are going to overeat. So that will just come with practice. Just know that is normal. In intuitive eating, we're probably going to do some overeating, and that's very, very normal. Now, with a binge eating, it's actually very different. So there's a few things I want you to watch out for with binge eating. And that doesn't mean try not to binge because that's not going to help you in your intuitive eating journey, but we just want to distinguish that from overeating. So with binge eating, this is where a person feels very urgent with their food. Like they need that food right away, and they often have a very specific craving for a food. Like, I need ice cream, or I'm not going to be satisfied with anything else. It's very common of somebody that is experiencing a binge. Another thing with a binge is while it often involves large quantity of foods, there is no specific quantity that constitutes as a binge. It's more about how much control we feel over the food. So, for example, if you have a bag of chips, can you put that bag away? Do you feel like you have to finish the bag? If you're feeling like you need to finish the bag or you can't stop eating unless you're really hurting, keeled over, tired, and having all of those symptoms of extreme fullness, then that may be a binge. Another thing with a binge is we often feel really guilty after we binge. So thinking about those three variables, the urgency, the control, and the guilt after a binge, those are the things that constitute a binge versus simply overeating because the food tastes good or it's only available for a certain time. So the first thing that's going to help you to not binge eat in our intuitive eating journey is actually to determine if we're doing it in the first place, or if it is in fact uh, just the overeating. And those two things are a little bit different as well from emotional eating, where maybe we've had a bad day, or maybe we're wanting to reward ourselves with food. And that is a very different experience than I'm overly full or I'm out of control with food. That might just be, I'd like to satisfy an emotion with a food. And while I might feel a little bit guilty about this because I shouldn't be eating because I'm not hungry, we're not actually pushing past that brink of fullness often or getting to that uncomfortable level. So when you are experiencing something like binge or overeating or emotional eating, as you're in your intuitive eating journey, just know that all these things can be normal. It's important for us to distinguish between them because we need to know how to respond to them, especially as we progress in our intuitive eating journey, and that is part of becoming an intuitive eater. So, one thing I do want to mention as well is that if you are binge eating already or you have a diagnosis of binge eating disorder, intuitive eating is not appropriate for you right now. Because what this means is that you are probably not actually able to navigate your hunger and fullness cues. So, what it will become is kind of a battle between trying to will your way into stopping food or finding, permissive factors for you to start eating food because you're not able to navigate those cues on your own. So, if you are actually binge eating before you start an intuitive eating journey, we need to work through the binges first with a qualified professional because that is actually typically a diagnosable eating disorder. And you'll want to work with a professional on creating a mechanical eating plan. Know that binge eating, emotional eating, and overeating are all different things, and they're also all part of learning to be an intuitive eater. The less we try to resist these things and work with our body to learn our hunger and fullness sensations and the cues that it's giving us, the more successful we'll be as an intuitive eater. And these things will pass. All of these things will pass as we're learning to intuitively eat, and we will be able to create a healthy and peaceful relationship with food.